When Plato differentiated between the body and the soul, he laid the foundations of most religions and belief systems that continue to this day, based on a supreme being whose standards of spiritual morality we humans may aspire to, but frequently fall short due to our bodily desires, weaknesses, and limitations. Religions and churches based on faith and ecclesiastical hierarchy were developed to help us chart a way through life, but by the end of the Middle Ages, they had grown in authority and influence to the point where they exercised control over many aspects of life and discouraged challenge or dissent. Bolstered and promoted by the advent of the printing press and the consequent sharing of ideas, education and independent thought developed and became more widespread. Focus on mathematics, science and logic became more prevalent, and thinkers or philosophers such as René Descartes and John Locke emphasised the place of reason, evidence and proof, rather than blind faith and dogma, though their logic was often applied to proving God's existence. This intellectual movement grew steadily, and its proponents grew more daring in terms of conclusions and more challenging to the ecclesiastical and political status quo. In the course of the 18th century, a series of philosophers, including Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot and Hume, effectively offered reasoned challenges to the authority of those in religion-based power. Their argument ran, in a very simplified and condensed form, that God and therefore morality may not exist. Therefore those in authority, who generally ruled in the name of God, had to justify by reason their policies and should be held accountable for their actions, as all men were to be considered equal. This came to be known as the Enlightenment Movement, and its intellectual, political and practical repercussions, including indirectly the French Revolution, cannot be overstated. This represented a revolution in thought, but also in political and practical consequence. Equality, responsibility, accountability and justification were now expected, and this new outlook had enormous repercussions in the 19th century, politically, socially and economically in terms of democratic government, social unrest and even, perhaps, the ban on slavery, as individuals gained the inspiration and confidence to challenge the status quo and demand fairness for all. Philosophically, and in terms of our perception of ourselves as functioning human beings, these ideas also had something of an impact, and this is perhaps best illustrated through examples of the literature of the time and the concepts of duality they present. Initially convinced by Plato's distinction between the body and the soul, then influenced and directed by religious elements before having his beliefs upended by philosophical claims that God and morality may not exist, mankind was in something of a moral and philosophical quandary by the mid-19th century. Beneath the facade and veneer of respectability, social tolerance and conformity, is there a raging cauldron of desires, impulses and ambitions, held in check by the distraction of work and routine, the common acceptance and expectations of social groups, and limitations for the common good set by law, morality and religion? What if these limits had no sovereignty and are merely social conventions? Circumstances can cause a person to recognise and possibly embrace man's baser instincts, and the consequences of succumbing to the temptation of conceding to impulse and desire are explored in the 5 works to which I will refer. In Les Fleurs du Mal, 1857, Charles Baudelaire presents a collection of poems that describe and investigate conflict between nature and social conformity or expectation within the individual. Baudelaire encapsulates a desire for spiritual purpose and buoyancy, but this is punctured and deflated by the prospect of the non-existence of God and morality as proposed in the principles of the Enlightenment. Spurred on by the inevitability of death and the apparent pointlessness of life, he supports, indeed promotes, physical gratification and indulgence as a consequence of this turning away from the spiritual and the more elevated purposes of the mind. The division between the body and the mind, or soul, is clearly made, and Baudelaire is overwhelmingly of the opinion that our bodily needs and desires will always win out over our spiritual attempts to impose control or discipline, and any short-lived regrets we may experience following our adventures. That said, his contention does not seem to extend to matters of criminality, but is rather focused on physical indulgence and pleasure without oversight. However, in Les Misérables, 1862, Victor Hugo makes a clear case for the capacity of man to rise above his base desires and social conditioning, and to impose a form of moral order by way of compassion and understanding. Having served 19 years in penal servitude for a relatively minor crime, Jean Valjean becomes the very creature he was accused of being all these years before, a self-centered opportunist thief. However, as a result of kindness and generosity shown to him, he realizes that there is a choice to be made, and he abandons his outlook of personal survival at the expense of others in favor of compassion, tolerance, and dignity. The division or conflict between the two pathways is therefore drawn, but Valjean displays a spiritual determination and strength to put humanity and compassion for others above his personal needs and ambitions, whether God and morality exist or not. Although Valjean is inspired by a bishop, it is the bishop's kindness and concern that motivate him, not his faith or position, emphasizing the importance and accessibility of humanity as a source of motivation. In Crime and Punishment, 1866, Fyodor Dostoevsky juxtaposes apparent freedom to put one's own best interests above those of others, ultimately leading to murder, with the consequences, moral and practical, of these actions. Nihilism, resulting from the affirmation that God and morality do not exist, may lead to egotism and a sense of social superiority. Some individuals may appear to lead lives that are worthier than others, and it takes little rationalization to convince poor student Raskolnikov that he is entitled to commit the murder of an elderly pawnbroker for his advantage. However, an underlying compulsion towards humanity and compassion affect him, and, despite his attempts to rationalize the situation and appeals to nihilistic reasoning, he is dogged by guilt and conscience which cause illness and out-of-character responses. Eventually, obsession and paranoia lead to confession and punishment, and this leads to a form of social rehabilitation by virtue of a friend whose love and guidance allow him to appreciate the value of humanity. Dostoevsky focuses on the spiritual or psychological aspect of man, having had Raskolnikov stoop to the depths of murder. God and morality may not exist, but there remains a common bond of life among people, one that requires respect for the existence of others, and that lends limits to our actions and attitudes towards others, though this respect needs to be cultivated and protected to be fully effective. In The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1886, R.L. Stevenson makes the division of the two aspects of man's nature all the more effective by way of a physical transformation between the two. One presentation is the law-abiding, principled and outwardly virtuous Dr. Jekyll, while the other is a self-indulgent and narcissistic Mr. Hyde. Jekyll's aim in separating these two facets of his character is to allow each to fully blossom and not to encroach on or impede the other. Although we are given scant detail of Mr. Hyde's misadventures, we are assured of their awfulness, but also of Jekyll's pleasure in being guilt-free and being able to focus on good and charitable works. However, Jekyll starts to take pleasure in Hyde's conscience-free indulgences, and this allows the Hyde side of his character to develop beyond his control and to take precedence over his civilized and principled self. The essential notion is that by separating and indulging the two sides of our nature, we free ourselves of internal conflict and may focus our efforts with greater purity and therefore greater success. That said, it is strongly implied that indulgence of our base desires without limits set by concepts of compassion and morality would be disastrous. We may even conclude that each side of our nature may be necessary to man's survival, but a balance between the two is essential, with the dark side providing motivation, desire and enthusiasm, but held in check by compassion, empathy and humanity. In La Bête Humaine, The Beast Within, 1890, Émile Zola seems to suggest that work and routine provide distraction, therapy and stability which allow us to control or ignore our base desires and personal ambitions. Scientific and technological advances in the shape of the railway system, transport and communication may have had a profound effect on the shape of society, but society's component parts retain age-old problems regarding passion, self-control and respect for others. Here, there is little attempt to exercise control or respect society's conventions and principles, as our protagonists or antagonists concede to emotion and instinct as they have affairs, seek revenge and plot murder. They display intelligence and cunning only in how to achieve their aims and evade punishment. There is a casual acceptance of lack of consideration for others and indulgence of one's own desires and sense of fulfillment. Caution is exercised only in the pursuit of self-protection, not in the effect of actions on others, to the point of deprivation of life, suggesting that spirituality or morality have diminished and people simply follow their feelings or impulses. This represents a significant development and departure from the previous entries in that consideration for others, or common humanity, now appears to hold little appeal. Readers see also that the actions of the main characters impact many innocent lives, drawing attention to the existential premise that our actions exercise an influence on others, and we should perhaps take that influence into account when considering our plans and deeds. These existential concepts will be greatly developed and expanded with the advent of the world wars and the ensuing political and social change, while duality will be explored, explained and given psychological validation by Sigmund Freud in 1920 and again in 1923. Freud suggests the two conflicting elements, the id being our base or inner instincts, and the superego being external forces of control and social limitation, are balanced by the ego, which acts as an arbiter and judge in terms of how best to proceed in the situations we face. In the course of the 20th century, existentialism rather overtook the concept of duality, or perhaps it grew out of the casual acceptance of our moral dilemma, as suggested by Zola. Whatever its roots, with its insistence that God and morality do not exist, and its affirmation that we are morally free to act as we wish, existentialism apparently does away with justification and moral conflict. We simply do as we feel. Many seized on these contentions to support nihilism, but they failed to take into account the second part of the existential doctrine, that if freedom is the only truth, and if we are entitled to that freedom, it is wrong to deprive others of it. Indeed, the whole basis for much mid-century existential literature is the exploration of the impact and influence we have on one another and the extent to which we should feel responsible for any impact or influence. In the 21st century, rather than pursue concepts of responsibility, common humanity and empathy, there appears to be a development of casual acceptance of our moral freedom and a turning away from compassion, conformity and even definition. There is a move to simply be, recognising no social restrictions, limits or even, some would argue, objective truth, and the focus seems to be on egotistical assertiveness and self-indulgence, and this has led to an increasingly fragmented and divided society. It is interesting to note that religion played little or no part in the evolution of these ideas, perhaps reflecting man's desire to find a cohesive base for morality based on humanity and common experience rather than nebulous beliefs and man's potential manipulation of such beliefs. My thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you found it of some value.